I just want to introduce our next speaker. He is an American product designer, interior architect, and educator. In 2002, he founded his studio in Los Angeles. Since then, he has gone on to become one of America's top independent designers. His career balances design work for high-end European design brands, strategic consulting for large corporations, and teaching the next generation as an associate professor at Art Center College of Design. Cory holds an architecture degree from SUNY Buffalo and a degree in design from Art Center. Cory designed this beautiful space that you're actually in right now, the Supply Frame Design Lab, as well as the Supply Frame headquarters. Please welcome to the Hackaday Superconference stage, Cory Grosser.
Hi, everybody. I've given lots of lectures all over the world, but this is the first time speaking in some place that I designed, so it's a little weird. Okay, so what to talk about at a hardware conference? And I think my thought was to kind of try to bring together a lot of the work that I've done at Art Center over the last 10 years and what I'm interested in. So at Art Center, I guess, I don't really know what my students think about me, but I think I'm the difficult teacher that talks about feelings a lot. So really, this presentation is about feelings. It's about emotion, because I think in a way that that's the last frontier of design, and that's what, if we think about the future of design, that's the next challenge. It's called Understanding the Power of Emotional Design, and it deals with what I call innovation aesthetics. Okay, so, we're a small studio. We're here in Pasadena, very close to this lab. Even though we're a small studio, I think we have really exciting and good clients. Most meetings with most clients start out basically the same way, again, talking about feelings. And I think the clients look at me and like, hey man, I hired a designer, not a therapist. But I think as we move forward with the presentation, hopefully this all makes more sense. So, as was mentioned, we did design the lab you're in here, and it's a pretty cool story. Steve Flagg, the CEO of Supply Frame, asked me to lunch, and he said, we want to create a lab for makers, engineers, the community, but we want to make sure designers come too. What should I do? And by the end of the lunch, I convinced Steve, if you want designers to come, let us design it and then we'll come. So I think he was a little skeptical, but in the end, I hope it worked. So I think I'm not going to say too much about the lab, other than when you're here, it's supposed to express emotions. You're supposed to feel. So in the beginning, we didn't really know the program of the lab. We didn't know what this place would become. But what we did know is Supply Frame, had Hackaday, and in a way, the very essence of this lab was to be for you guys, to be for the Hackaday community, and it was in a way a physical manifestation of an online entity. So the initial challenge, when we really didn't understand what the function of the lab would be, is how do we make it feel like Hackaday? And that's basically the way we like to start all our projects. How are you supposed to feel when you use it? How are you supposed to feel when you're there? Okay, so if we talk about design maxims, this is probably like in the holy trinity of design maxims, right? Form follows function. And it was actually coined by an architect called Louis Sullivan, although many people probably lay claim to it. And the basic premise, or the way we teach it in design school, is that you design something based on its function, clearly. But does form really follow function? So if we look at a spoon, which is a very, very basic object, and let's just for a second imagine that you've never seen a spoon. You might be able to figure out what to do with it. The shape of the top of the spoon has a little cup where you put the soup, and it has a little handle. You know, you put your hand on the handle, and you eat. So in this sense, sure, the form can follow the function. This is a chair that we designed. It's right there. You can tell us how it feels. And again, this is also a very simple object, and the form can basically follow the function. And it's an object that's you can understand. You basically kind of put your butt in the center, and then you sit down, and it's got some levers and buttons if you need to move it up and down. But in general, sure, the form can follow the function. Now, here we are in technology. Now, I very quickly, in 3 minutes, tried to list all the things that I do on my phone in a typical day. You know, and I think very rapidly I was up to 20, 30 functions, right? But the phone does hundreds or maybe thousands of functions. So how can you design an object with form based on function when the object itself does 1,000 functions? It's actually not possible. So we're entering a stage where the idea of form follow functions is actually impossible to achieve. So what do you do? Okay, so keep that in mind. So in class, we talk a lot about what I like to call the psychology of form. And that means basically, if we talk about the aesthetics of design or composition, the formal properties, color, they all have a certain psychology to them. And I break it down 3 ways, into the intuitive, the rational, and the narrative. Okay, so, oops. Sorry. There it is. Okay, perfect. There's been several studies that have looked at when we can start to process aesthetics. And this particular study was done at the University of Sussex in 1994. And basically, what they did was they put infants in front of a projector, and there's a projector on the left, a projector on the right, and then they flash images of people's faces. And they have images of very, very beautiful people and images of average people. And do you know which ones the babies prefer? The beautiful ones, absolutely. So what they do is they monitor their eye movement and see how long the babies stare at what I guess we would consider beautiful. At first, when they started to do these studies, they basically said this is about symmetry. But it's not. It's actually this particular study proved that it wasn't about symmetry. So at the age of 4 months, we are able to decipher aesthetics. We know this. Okay, when I was in architecture school, there was a professor called Michael Brill. And he did he was part of a really interesting project for the Department of Energy. And in Nevada, there's this waste isolation pilot plant. And it's basically a place where they store nuclear fuel. And at the waste isolation plant, engineers had determined that they can basically make containers to hold the nuclear waste that will last 10,000 years. The problem is the nuclear waste is effective for 24,000 years, so giving us a gap of 14,000 years. And so what they decided to do was they basically, instead of trying to engineer a better container that could last longer than 10,000 years, they basically went to architects, a series of architects, and psychologists and artists and scientists, and said, how can we warn future civilizations that this is a really, really dangerous place. So one of the proposals, or most of the proposals, basically dealt with what we call the psychology of form. So as you can see from the image, there's all of these spikes. And the idea is that you see these spikes and that you know it's dangerous, right? So, and it's interesting because it has to outlast probably language, right? We're talking 14,000 years. So the idea is that the forms have so much power and so much energy. And if you just think about it for a second, just think for a second about what we call a river stone. So that's a stone that the water kind of flows over and over. I'm sure you've all seen them. If you think about a river stone, it feels nice. Like the psychology of the form is basically comforting. If you think about an orange, right? You have the bright color, it's round, it's a little bit squishy. You know it's basically a safe object. Now think for a second about a knitting needle, right? If you don't touch the knitting, you still know it's dangerous. Again, these are things that are probably natural to us, just like the study of with the babies. So that's the first, I would say the first part of emotional design is this idea of the instinctive, the rational. Okay, so I love circles. You know, I think in general we try to design things with circles and squares and very simple geometry. But a circle, a square, a triangle, these are pure geometries. They're based on math, right? That's us basically inputting data to create a circle. It's really a human construct. And it's comfortable and basically pretty easy for us to understand, but it's probably not natural. So, in 1953, a guy by the name of Henry Dreyfuss, who was one of kind of the fathers of what we would call American industrial design, designed the T86 thermostat. And he loved circles too, and so he made a sketch of a circle and said, hey, let's make something with this. Now, it was probably influenced by radio dials. So in the 40s, when the radio came about, people would go up to their radio and they would turn the dial. So they had some kind of some kind of learned behavior based around the circle. And another brilliant thing about this particular product is that it was never crooked on the wall. So, and it also, if you've ever had this, dust will fall off. So like the thermostat that I have at home is square on top and it's gross at the top. So it was a brilliant product. It lasted for 50 years. I think you can probably still buy it today and probably still install it. And of course, if we look at what nested with theirs, you can see there's a pretty clear relationship between the two. And it's a product that makes a lot of sense. So it's what we would call a rational object. It just makes sense, right? It's smart, it's simple, it's pure, and it's easy to understand. Okay, so first we have the instinctive idea. Then we have the rational idea. Let's talk a little bit about the narrative idea. Anyone know what this is? What's that? Close. Yeah. This was designed by us quite a long time ago. And it's close to a pen holder, but it's a wine holder. Now, it's not particularly beautiful. It's truthfully not particularly functional. But it tells a story, right? I mean, it takes up this much space. The company's like, you know, it takes up a lot of space. Yes, I know. But when I was a kid, I was in a youth bowling league, and my mom has like pictures of me with like my bowling trophy, you know. And so we had kind of had this idea: how can we? And this was for a kind of a fancy Italian design company. How can we take a little slice of Americana and combine it with kind of really fancy Italian design and kind of make an object? But it's what we call a narrative object. You actually need the story for the object to really make any sense, since it's not beautiful and it's not really functional. and it's called wine bowl. Okay, so if Louis Sullivan said form follows function, probably a more recent but also well-traveled maxim is form follows emotion. And Helmut Essinger said that, and his firm Frog Design basically did the Apple Snow White products, so the very early Apple products. And he believed that form really was related to our emotions. And honestly, just like Louis Sullivan, I agree. Yeah, sure. So this was on the cover of a book that I'm going to talk about in a second, but does anyone know what this object is? It's a juicer. Yeah, so probably some of you have read this book or maybe have this item. There it is. Okay, so let's be honest. Is it a good juicer? Is it a functional juicer? I suppose it's functional. Does it function well? I don't think so, right? It doesn't work that well. But does that mean it's a bad object? Does that mean it's not worthwhile? And I would say no. So there was a series of books that if you haven't read, I highly recommend and suggest you do, by a gentleman, a cognitive scientist named Don Norman. And Donald Norman at first wrote a book basically saying that objects should be functional to have meaning. And then in 2004, he wrote a follow-up book saying, well, okay, maybe they don't all have to function perfectly. Maybe objects can still have meaning when they don't function as well. Because let's think a little bit about why you might want a juicer that doesn't juice well. Well, maybe you think it's beautiful. Maybe when people come over, they see it and say, what the heck is that? And you say, oh, it's a juicer. So you start a dialogue. So it's an object basically about conversation. Maybe it's done by a famous designer, which it is. And maybe you want to have a piece that they have designed that's relatively affordable. So there's all these reasons that you might want to have a juicer that doesn't function well. Because most juicers, honestly, you're probably going to put them in the cupboard where no one could see them, but this one you're probably going to leave out. Okay, so in Donald Norman's emotional design book and in his research, he basically talks about the levels that we process emotions. And this has become really critical kind of thinking or critical teaching in interaction design. But he splits it basically in three ways: the visceral, the behavioral, and the reflective. So the visceral. If you've ever experienced love at first sight, this is the visceral. The baby seeing the beautiful people and staring a little bit longer, this is the visceral. This is you seeing something and wanting it, like that. It's your initial gut reaction. It's instinctive. The behavioral, this is the Honeywell thermometer, right? This is something's rational and that it works well. I assume most of you in this room are really strong right here at the rational and making things work well. The reflective, that's based on experience or stories. This is where branding comes into play. This is where the self-image of objects come into play. This is where aspiration comes into play. Okay, so let's take a basic product that we all know. When I was still at Art Center, my roommate, he did an internship at 8 Inc., which is a design firm that basically had the Apple Store account. So they basically designed the Apple stores right from the beginning. And as a gift for his internship, they gave him this object, this white object. And I don't know if it had been released yet, but if it had, we're talking like within a week. Nobody knew what this object was. I didn't know what the object was. He brings it to the house. He says, look what they gave me. And I said, I want that. What does it do? Right? So I still so specifically remember that I wanted something that I didn't completely understand. Right? So that's the visceral at work. And I can tell you why. Like remember it had a chrome back, and it had that little piece of plastic that looked like glass that was around so for a piece of electronic hardware at the time, or even now, I mean, it was really, really a special token, right? I knew I wanted it. That's visceral. Over time, of course, they take away some of the buttons, they make the scroll wheel work better, and now you want it again. Like, oh, or they make the Nano. I remember that little black one. I'm like, oh, I have to have that too. Like, I need that thing, right? But that's behavioral, right? We're now in the more functional kind of rational mode. They're making it easier to use. And then they did something that I personally think was really, really smart. Before the iPod, earphones were black, almost always, right? It was the first time they introduced white earphones. I'm sure you could get them, but no one had white earphones. You had black earphones. So if you're on a subway in New York, you see someone else with the little white buds sticking out of their ears, and you say, I'm with you. We're together, right? This is what we call identity production, or what we call the tribe. So you're part of a group, right? This is one example of kind of the reflective brain processing, right? You say, I'm with you, I'm part of you. If you want to think of this, I really need this because I want to be part of the tribe, I want the latest thing, I love that brand, right? These are all things that take some time to kind of develop. And they're not functional. White, black, it doesn't matter. And really, they're actually, besides the color, it's not really aesthetic. Okay, they'll tell you in my office, this is a quote I really like. The most beautiful curve is a rising sales graph. And that was said in the 30s or 40s by Raymond Loewy, who generally is kind of considered the father of, or the godfather of American industrial design. So, streamlined trains, the Studebaker Avanti, he did tons of work for Coca-Cola, he designed Air Force One. But in the early days of American industrial design, or when this was happening, they realized that companies, brands, and designers realized that if you could make things more beautiful, they would sell better, right? So hence the quote. So I'm going to give some examples from the car industry. We've done over the years quite a bit of work for the auto industry. And one thing I really like about the car industry is everyone understands that you buy a car for emotional reasons, mostly, right? Sometimes you buy it for functional reasons, but you often buy it for emotional reasons. Or at the very least, emotions are really tied into your purchase. So one thing they teach you in design school is that somehow style is like a bad word. Style is not a bad word. There's nothing wrong with the idea of style. And car companies have accepted this from the beginning. So let's go back a little bit. If we think I'm giving another personal experience, and I'm using a GM product, even though Ford used to be our client. But when I first saw this car, like the iPod, I'm like, I want that. That visceral, immediate reaction. It's not a luxury brand. Didn't have a fancy badge, right? It's truly a really impractical car. I mean, I don't even know if you can truly fit a suitcase in this. Does anyone have this car? I don't think you can fit a suitcase, or it will be a very small suitcase. But formally, aesthetically, I wanted the car. I think it's beautiful. Okay, so practical. I have 2 kids. My girlfriend has 2 kids. So we would go everywhere in 2 cars like this, to the pizza shop and everywhere. And it was difficult, but this is now my current car. And it seats 7, and it's eminently practical, right, as big, giant SUVs are. It's really hard to park, but other than that, it's a practical car. So this, in a way, is kind of the rational part of our decision-making working. And it, truthfully, because I'm really interested in the visceral and I'm really interested in the reflective, this was a very difficult purchase for me, as they'll tell you in the studio. Probably sick of hearing this. Okay, so it's pretty cool, as Sid Mead mentioned last night, that this place at one time was a Maserati dealership. And I remember when I was an early student at Art Center, I think it's still, maybe it was just the tail end of its life as a Maserati dealer. I used to drive by and like, wow, like someday, like I'm getting that car someday. And then probably 8 years ago, we did a project for Bentley Motors, and they flew me to the factory, which is in outside of Manchester. And I toured the factory. Don't tell them, but at the time, I just wasn't that big of a Bentley fan. Seemed a little, little fancy for me. But after touring the factory and seeing how some of the Bentleys are made, it reminded me of the way that our chairs are made in a wood shop. I mean, truly, people like sanding pieces of the dashboard. And I couldn't help but be like, wow, like super impressed by the way the cars were basically put together. So then I became a fan of Bentley. And in fact, after the project, they said, hey, Cory, would you like to drive the car? We'll give you a car for 2 weeks. And I was like, my little girl is not going to take a crap in the back of a $200,000 car. No, thank you. I'm good. Anyway, this is the idea of the aspirational, or it's the reflective part of your brain working, right? This is where brands and the things that maybe you can't afford, but you still buy, you still want them. This is kind of how that part of your brain operates. Okay, so my grandfather was a machinist, and I think my mom would say that I'm quite a bit like him. The other day, a week ago or 2 weeks ago in the office, I said, we need a compass. It's probably the first time that I've said that in 5 years. Someone get a compass. And I said, in the drawer is my grandfather's compass. And someone in the office said, I'm not using that. I'm like, okay. And although we don't need a compass anymore because we draw circles with computers, of course, or we try to draw them really, really nicely by hand, it's an object that means a lot to me. It has a lot of energy, a lot of power. It represents a lot. It represents my grandfather. It represents the history of the creation of things, because he's a machinist and I'm a designer. And we were, when he was alive, we used to talk about how to make things, and he would help me make things. So in a way, the object itself has a lot of meaning for me. And I suppose this is the reflective part working too. It's your history. So can we do this can we give objects that we create this same value? I think we can. And I'm going to try to give an example. So here's a Beetle ad from 1959. And I wasn't around, but if you were around, perhaps you remember that the campaign was literally brilliant. Literally brilliant. So what they did was they knew that they had this quirky car, right, that didn't go too fast, didn't hold a lot, and they basically used all the things that maybe someone could use against the car as the ad campaign. One that said, think small, right? Another one said, if it runs out of gas, at least you can push it. And so through the advertising, they basically started to grab a demographic, people that basically thought a little bit differently. Right? Sounds like the 80s. And what happened? So, oh no. What do you think? 10 minutes, okay, thanks. So what do you guys think happened as it loads? So another tribe, exactly. And the next slide, it's Woodstock, right? Right? It's counterculture, flower power. Is it coming back to us, Michael? So a whole new generation basically takes this car on. Herbie the Love Bug, the microbus, right? And then in 1997, after some time passes, a group of people that were hired or worked with Volkswagen came up with this idea to create the new Beetle. And they had to go back to their German counterparts and say, look, we want to create a new car based on the old Beetle. And in Germany, they're like, I don't know. Because in Germany, the historical context or the reflective part of the Beetle was very, very different, right? Because in reality, it was Hitler's car. So their perception was much different than our perception. So they convinced through a very cool concept car, and I'm sure it's froze. Yeah, sure. There's only 5 more. Just need 5 more. So it had basically a very different context. And what they did was they took our perception or our history. So even though I wasn't born in the 60s, I don't know, I wasn't at Woodstock, I have all these associations and these ideas of what that was or what that would be. And basically, the new Beetle was born and resold as an interpretation of that. My mom has a cute little red Volkswagen Bug convertible, right? In the front, there's a little flower vase that's or in the first generation, there's a little flower vase, right? There was no flower vase in Volkswagen Beetle circa 1950, right? This was a new addition. So in a way, it was a choice, a design choice to spark the reflective memory part of our brain. Yay. Okay, happy Ave. All right, thank you. Okay, so as I just talked about, there's Woodstock, there's flower power. So this is the advertising. My mom's car. My dad would be mortified every time he would get in, like the flower would be. And here's the upcoming, if you saw it, the ID buzz concept. So if you look at the marketing, you look at the advertising, what are they basically doing? They're kind of using California, surfer culture, palm trees, right? It's basically sparking all these things in your reflective memory. So we have all these quotes, so I decided to add my own. And mine is, design is empathy, right? And I think I've heard the word empathy quite a bit at the conference, and it's often, it's about putting the user first. But I say it's quite a bit more than that. It's actually trying to anticipate how someone is going to feel. So that's what happened. That's what we try to do in this lab, and that's what we try to do with every product that we create. How is this going to make someone feel? Can we get that initial pop, that initial gut reaction, that visceral reaction? Can we do that? This lab, that's what the front is supposed to do when you walk in and it's totally white. Do you know the white floor? They had to get it clean before this. Like it gets dirty so fast, right? And we knew that when we designed it. I said, it's going to get dirty really fast, but it's that initial kind of instinctual reaction. Rational, not so much. So we're concerned with that part. And then there's the functional part. Can you use it? Does it work? Now that there's people in here working, things need to be changed. We need more storage here and more room here. And that makes complete sense because we need the behavior of the people. We need to learn from the behavior of the people that use this place. So that's the rational part, right? And then we get to the reflective part. So if you're part of the Hackaday community and you think about what it means to you or what the website looks like or just the energy of making something all night and staying up and really trying to create something, that's the feeling that you're supposed to get here. So I thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions, let me know.